The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to explore and explain key features of texts and how they contribute to meaning. Learners should be able to recognize how word choices, imagery, and sound devices affect mood, meaning, and theme. This lesson is also linked to Learning Outcome 3, Writing and Presenting. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to demonstrate the use of writing strategies and techniques for first drafts. Learners should be able to identify and use stylistic and rhetorical devices such as figurative language, word choice, vivid description, personal voice and style, tone, symbol, color, placement, and sound.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. In our previous lessons, we looked at what to be aware of when studying poetry, and in this lesson, we will be putting all of that together. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to read poetry for enjoyment and analyze poetry and comment on its meaning. I want to show you how to deal with poetry at school so that your English marks can improve. But I also want to help you to enjoy poetry as a creative form of expression. Poetry is an enjoyable and effective form of writing, and the more you look at it, the more you will be able to understand and appreciate what poets are trying to say. You will also see that poetry can be a good way to express yourself and communicate your feelings. We will start by looking at a poem that was written purely for enjoyment and humor. I'm sure you'll enjoy this. One Perfect Rose by Dorothy Parker. A single flower he sent me since we met. All tenderly his messenger he chose. Deep-hearted, pure, with scented dew still wet. One perfect rose. I knew the language of the floweret. My fragile leaves, it said, his heart enclose. Love long has taken for its amulet one perfect rose. Why is it no one ever sent me yet one perfect limousine, do you suppose? Oh no, it's always just my luck to get one perfect rose. I'm sure that you'll agree that this poem is very different from the serious, somber, important sounding poems we've dealt with so far. I included this to show you that poetry doesn't have to be this intimidating, over-serious study all the time. Sometimes it can just be fun. Now let's look at the theory we've learnt in this series. We have looked at emotive and effective descriptions, stanzas, rhyme and rhythm, poet's intention, metaphors and similes, personification, style, tone, and mood and atmosphere. Now I know this seems like a very intimidating list, but as we go through the lesson, you will realize how much of it you can remember. We will start by looking at two South African poems. We will work through the poems, analyzing them together. Our first poem is by Ahmad Dango, and it is called Paradise. Read with me. O paradise, cool paradise of Africa, what memories you recreate. Oh, why do you tighten the chains? Let's start by looking at the style of Dango's writing. You'll remember from previous lessons that when you comment on style, you need to talk about the sentences, word choices, and register that have been used. So let's consider these. Obviously, Dango's subject is familiar to all of us here. He is writing about Africa, and he's calling it paradise. His style is informal, and the language he uses is uncomplicated and direct. Do you notice that he is speaking directly to Africa? This figure of speech is called apostrophe. Do you know what apostrophe is? Apostrophe is when an inanimate object, a person who is no longer alive, or an abstract idea is spoken to as if it were a human being. It is addressed directly. He asks the question, "Why do you tighten the chains?" This is an example of a rhetorical question. The poet is asking the question for effect. He does not really expect an answer. If we look at the structure, we can see two stanzas, one with 3 lines and the other with 2. This is significant because in the first stanza, the poet is praising Africa, whilst in the second stanza, he's asking a difficult question. So the structure of the poem helps to highlight the poet's conflicting feelings about Africa. It is also worth mentioning that the second stanza is made up completely of a question, which we have already said is a rhetorical question. He also repeats the words paradise and why. What is repetition used for in poetry? By repeating certain words or phrases, poets are able to emphasize emotions or meaning. Here, Dangor has emphasized his love for Africa by repeating paradise, and he strengthened the hurt and despairing tone by repeating the questioning word why. So the tone of Dangor's poem is despairing and questioning. He's trying to understand why Africa and its society is treating him so harshly. There's another aspect of poetry that I would like to discuss with you before we continue. Context. Context refers to the background of a piece of writing. And the context is always important because novelists and poets are influenced by what is happening in the world around them. What do you think the context of this poem is? This poem was written during the apartheid era in South Africa, and its intention is to criticize the policies of racial segregation of the government of the time. We can work this out from the poet mentioning that Africa is a paradise, but that oppression or chains that are being tightened mar it. Now that we know more about the poem's background, we are in a better position to comment on the poet's intention and message. We can imagine that the poet's intention is to criticize and encourage change in our country at the time. His message, I suggest, would be to encourage the reader to realize the injustice of the society. His message is one of protest against injustice. Now let's look at one more thing before we move on to another poem. Figures of speech. Dangor uses one comparison in our example. Did you recognize it? The poet compares the feeling of chains being tightened to difficult circumstances in his life. What is the comparison he uses? It's a metaphor. The qualities of tightening chains are applied directly to the circumstances of his life. I'm sure that you managed to follow this analysis quite easily and that you remembered a lot of the terms that we have spoken about. Now let's look at another South African poem. Learning by Modikwe Dikobe. Learning has no limitations. Last year I made mistakes. The previous year I blundered. This year I shall do better. In the Garden of Eden I learned to make fire, clothe myself and have children. The world is boundless. Each one of us can contribute, provided we pluck off complexes, fear, and mistrust. Already you should have some idea of what the poet's intention and message is. Modikwe gives us this positive message. He is saying that it is possible that each one of us can contribute to making the world a better place. His intention is to encourage us to keep learning and understanding our world. Now let's look at the symbol he uses. He writes about being in the Garden of Eden. This place comes out of the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish religions, and represents the very beginnings of humans and human societies. By using this symbol, Modikwe can explain that the poem is about him, but also about all of humanity. What do you think the mood of this poem is? It seems to me that Modikwe is hopeful that if we can all pluck off the complexes, fear and mistrust, the world could become a far better place. The mood he creates is one of optimism and hope for the future. I want to point out two phrases Modikwe used and why I think that they are effective. They are blundered and pluck off. Blundered is a word to emphasize how stupid a mistake was. So Modikwe, in one word, manages to point out that the errors he and the whole of humanity make are really silly and unacceptable. And then the words pluck off seem to imply decisive action we all should take to get rid of our complexes, fears, and mistrust. So the choice of particular words or the diction the poet chooses to use can add to the message the poet is trying to communicate. I mentioned in Lesson 1 that poetry is a good way of communicating emotions, and in this poem, the poet's emotions are clearly communicated. Let's trace the emotions the poet shares with us as his poem develops. His opening claim is optimistic and positive. And then the next few lines explain how he has made mistakes, even big ones, but by the last line of the first stanza, the positive emotions emerge again. He writes, "This year I shall do better." Stanza 2 deals with the poet's idea of how human history has evolved, and then he makes the very optimistic statement to open stanza 3. Without restrictions and limitations on the ability of people to achieve, the world is boundless. I want to briefly discuss with you the formality of language or register that a poet chooses to use in a poem. The poems that we have looked at in this series mostly dealt with everyday language, and this is so that the poet can communicate directly with his peers. You will find poems with a more formal register though, but that does not mean that it would be more difficult. In fact, if you use the vocabulary and the techniques that we used in this series to analyze poetry, you should be able to analyze any poem. Now here are some more tips when analyzing poetry. If you are asked to analyze an unseen poem, a good way to start would be to read the poem carefully, consider the context and decide on the poet's message and intention. Consider the structure, diction and register, which is formality of language, to motivate your interpretation. And then find all the figures of speech and symbols in the poem and discuss why they were used effectively. I hope you are now better equipped with skills and knowledge to approach poetry with more confidence at school. Join me for our last lesson in the series of studying poems. Bye-bye.